In the last lecture, I asked you to think about what would happen if we all were suddenly granted telepathy. I pointed out that lying would become impossible, but so would politeness, tact, and civility. Politeness and civility are closely related kinds of social capital that require the polite or civil communicator to impose at least some ignorance on the receivers of their communications. Sometimes less virtuous acts, such as threats, offers of bribes, and sexual advances, also involve the use of ignorance. These all have in common a type of communication where the primary subject matter is never directly mentioned. In other words, communication proceeds by innuendo. In this lecture, we're going to examine the psychological and social functions that innuendo performs. Linguists refer to innuendos as off-record indirect speech acts. These have two components. The first component is indirection. Indirect communication requires that its recipient fill in the missing subject matter by inferring it from what has been said. So the polite phrase, "Please excuse me," delivered by a passenger on a crowded subway who's trying to exit at their stop, is indirect because it may actually mean something like, "I'm going to make bodily contact with you, but I'll say please excuse me because I'm a polite person," or even, "Get out of my way." The second component is being off-record. Off-record communication is genuinely unsaid, and therefore can be denied. When I was an undergraduate student, during summers I worked in a supply warehouse. We received shipments from suppliers and sent them out to fill orders from consumers. Most of my fellow workers belonged to an organized gang that regularly stole goods from the shipments, sold them, and divided the profits among themselves. After I'd worked there for a week, one of the gang leaders stood over me and said, "You know, you should be in on the action around here. You're missing out. You could make extra." I responded, "No, I don't want to get mixed up in that sort of thing." He replied, "That's too bad. Why don't you sleep on it?" I was only 18 years old, but I understood that the action meant joining the gang and stealing goods. I also knew "that's too bad" was a threat, and to sleep on it meant that he was giving me until the next morning to reconsider my position. All of the gang leader's statements were off record. If pressed, he could easily deny that he was referring to criminal activity or making a threat. However, there was a risk associated with off-record indirect communication, namely that it can readily be misinterpreted. In a 2010 paper on this topic, psychologists James Lee and Steven Pinker observed that off-record indirect communication is error-prone and inefficient, and therefore presents a puzzle for the students of communication. Why do people use this kind of communication so often, when being direct would be less risky and more efficient? A classic perspective on communication is based on a cooperative principle, the notion that communication is a cooperative undertaking between the speaker and the hearer. The hearer is believed to assume that the speaker is trying to be informative, truthful, clear, and relevant. Taken literally, this perspective would imply that indirect speech, especially off-record speech, should not exist. Instead, at the heart of this puzzle is a decision by the speaker about whether to impose uncertainty on the hearer, which in turn often is being made under uncertainty about the relationship between the speaker and the hearer. A theoretical analysis of politeness by Penelope Brown and Stephen Levinson in 1987 goes part of the way toward explaining how this decision gets made and why indirect speech is used so often. Brown and Levinson's theories extend the cooperative principle to the idea that the speaker and hearer are trying to maintain face, in the sense of saving face. Face-threatening communications include requests for favors, explanations of justifications, or information about private matters. These requests can be softened by being couched in polite terms. Politeness theory posits 4 strategic alternatives in ascending order of face-saving potency: positive politeness, sympathy, concern, or camaraderie; negative politeness, respect or deference; on-record indirectness; and off-record indirectness. A minor face threat might require only positive politeness, whereas a serious face threat would require off-record indirect speech. Compare, for instance, "We're both really busy, but could you do this for me?" and the more deferential, "I know you're really busy, but could you do this for me?" An example of on-record indirect request is, "This really needs to be done, but I can't manage it," and an off-record version might be, "There are a few tasks around here that need doing." Politeness theory also provides a partial explanation for the existence of civility. Civility prescribes moderate levels of politeness that enable people in uncertain but benign situations to deal effectively with one another. They may be strangers meeting for the first time, newly arrived members of a work team, or acquaintances in a novel situation that makes the nature of their relationship uncertain. According to politeness theory, indirect speech acts are maximally polite when they are off-record, because only then can the speaker plausibly deny that the intended meaning actually was meant. But this isn't how people view all varieties of off-record communication. One of Lee and Pinker's experiments demonstrated that no matter how face-threatening a request might be, people would not employ indirectness, but instead stuck with deferential negative politeness. Politeness theory also doesn't explain the use of off-record speech for purposes such as threats, offering bribes, sexual advances, and insults. The exchange I had with the gang leader of the warehouse was not a polite conversation. So, the cooperative principle theories of communication seem incompatible with the fact that off-record indirect speech is often accompanied by interpersonal conflict, as in bribes and threats. Evolutionary biologists such as Richard Dawkins and John Krebs provide quite a different view of communication. First, they point out that social relationships among conspecifics don't have a perfect correspondence of interests, but inevitably entail at least some conflicts of interest. So a lot of communication involves strategic speakers trying to manipulate the behavior of hearers to their advantage, and strategic hearers attempting to figure out the intentions of the speakers to their own advantage. Second, the biologists observe that relationships among conspecifics fall into qualitatively different categories, such as exploitative dominance versus reciprocal altruism. Therefore, a crucial issue for communicators is to negotiate and correctly identify what kind of relationship theirs is. If the nature of the relationship is unknown by the communicator, then in some situations an off-record indirect communication is the safest strategy because of its deniability. Lee and Pinker propose a strategic speaker theory to take into account the fact that communication is a mixed mode of enterprise involving elements of both cooperation and conflict or competition. The core of their theory proposes that indirect propositions or requests that permit plausible deniability afford the speaker a crucial advantage. A hearer favorably disposed to the request can accept it, whereas an unfavorable hearer cannot effectively react antagonistically to it. Lee and Pinker's second and third experiments tested their theory and found that the key to this advantage is that a favorably disposed hearer will typically respond with greater alacrity than an antagonistic one. So let's finish up by putting their theory into action using one of their examples. A man goes to a popular restaurant intending to have his evening meal there, but he has not made a reservation. The maitre d' informs him that he will have to wait for a considerable time before a seat becomes available. The customer now considers three alternatives. He can simply wait, he can make a direct offer of a bribe to the maitre d' in exchange for being seated sooner, or he can make an indirect, off-record attempt at a bribe. He must choose one of these, and he has to do so quickly. He has two unknowns to consider when making his decision. First, is the maitre d' dishonest enough to be tempted by the bribe? If so, then a direct offer would be more certain to be interpreted correctly than an indirect one. However, if not, then a direct offer could result in the customer being publicly humiliated in front of the other diners as the maitre d' berates and insults him. Second, is the maitre d' willing to relinquish his position of authority over the customer by seating him quickly in exchange for the bribe? If so, then either direct or indirect offer will get him seated. However, if not, then a direct offer will land him in difficulty. The indirect offer, for instance, is there a way to shorten my wait, has plausible deniability going for it. The customer knows that an honest or authoritarian maitre d' will think twice before accusing him of offering a bribe, realizing that he can stoutly and plausibly defend his ignorance in front of the other diners. A dishonest maitre d', however, won't hesitate to accept the bribe. Lee and Pinker's example is based on a real-life account. In 2000, a writer for the magazine Gourmet, Bruce Feiler, was assigned the task of determining what it would take to get seated promptly in a popular and overbooked New York restaurant. Feiler brought his girlfriend along to Balthazar, where, as he said, diners like me call a month in advance to try and secure a reservation. He was faced with the maitre d', who said they might be seated in an hour. The moment had arrived. Direct or indirect bribe offer. He leaned close to the maitre d', murmured, "I hope you can fit us in," and slipped $20 into the maitre d's hand. A mere 2 minutes later, they were seated at one of the better tables.